My name is Curtis Bell, and I make my living as a freelance photographer, mostly weddings, occasionally magazine work when it comes through. Every summer I drive somewhere alone for 2 weeks, no plan, just a full tank and a camera bag. It clears my head. This year I was headed west on Route 20, through the middle of nowhere in Nebraska, when I saw a man standing on the shoulder near mile marker 214, thumb out. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but there was nothing around for miles, the sun was going down, and something about leaving a guy stranded out there felt wrong. I pulled over. He climbed in, said his name was Perry, said his car broke down about 10 miles back. Normal enough story. He was maybe 30, wearing a flannel despite the heat, and he kept glancing at my camera bag on the back seat. "You a photographer?" he asked. "Yeah, weddings mostly. Curtis, right?" I hadn't told him my name. I laughed it off. Figured maybe he'd seen my name on something in the car, an insurance card on the visor, whatever. I asked him how he knew. He said, "Lucky guess," and smiled in a way that didn't feel like luck at all. I dropped him at the next town, a place called Ashford with one gas station and a diner. He thanked me, got out, and disappeared around the corner of the building faster than someone with a broken-down car 10 miles away should move. I sat in the parking lot for a second, unsettled, then told myself I was reading too much into it. People are strange, that's all. I went inside the diner to get coffee before finding a motel. The waitress looked at me, did a double take, and said, "Didn't think you'd be back so soon." I told her I'd never been to Ashford before in my life. She frowned, said, "You were in here Tuesday. Same jacket." Ordered the same thing, black coffee, no food. Today was Friday. I had been 400 miles east on Tuesday. I could prove it. I had photos time-stamped from a wedding I shot that day. I asked her if she was sure. She said she was positive, said the man even paid with a card that had my exact same first name on it, Curtis, because she'd made a comment about it since her nephew shared the name. I checked into the only motel in town, room 6, and I did not sleep much. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my door, slow, deliberate, stopping right in front of my room for close to a full minute before moving on. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing, no one. In the morning, the motel clerk, an older man, handed me my key back and said, "You want the same room as last time, or are you switching it up?" I told him this was my first night ever in this motel. He pulled up something on an old desktop monitor, turned it toward me. A registration from 11 months earlier. Curtis Bell. Same driver's license number as mine, he said, though I never showed him ID that morning. I'd paid cash. Something was very wrong in this town, and it had my name stitched into it. I started asking around instead of running, because running felt like it would just mean disappearing into whatever this was without understanding it. The diner waitress mentioned that the other Curtis always came in around the same time each visit, always alone, always paid cash, and once left behind a photography portfolio he never came back for. She still had it in the diner's lost and found box behind the counter. I opened it right there at the counter. Wedding photos. Good ones, professional ones, the kind of work that takes years to get right. And in the back sleeve, a business card. My business card, my actual real business card, except the phone number on it was different by 1 digit. Someone in this town had been using my name, my face apparently close enough to pass, and my professional identity to move through Ashford for almost a year, and the waitress swore up and down the resemblance was close enough that even she hadn't questioned it until I told her I'd never been there. I drove to the county sheriff's office that afternoon and reported it, laid out everything, the hitchhiker, the diner, the motel registration. The deputy taking my statement got quiet partway through and said, "We've had 2 identity fraud cases out of Ashford this year already. Both times, the victim's photo ID had been cloned onto a fake license using a real photo pulled off social media. We haven't caught who's behind it." He asked if I had any public photography accounts where my face was visible. I did. Every wedding photographer does. It's half the business, a bio photo, a website, and Instagram. I left Ashford that night and didn't stop until I crossed into Wyoming. 3 weeks after I got home, I got an email receipt for a storage unit rental in Ashford, Nebraska, paid for with a card in my name that I never opened. The unit number was 6. Same as my motel room. Before I left Wyoming behind entirely, I called the sheriff's deputy back to tell him about the storage unit. He asked me to forward the receipt, and 2 days later he called back with something that made the whole thing feel even less finished than before. The storage facility's own records showed the unit had first been rented 11 months earlier, the same date the motel clerk's computer had shown for my earlier stay, and it had been paid in full, month after month, without a single late payment, by a card ending in the same 4 digits as mine, linked to a billing address that was, impossibly, my actual home address in Ohio, an address I hadn't given anyone in Nebraska. The deputy asked me directly whether I had a twin, a estranged relative, anyone who could plausibly pass for me under a driver's license photo. I didn't. I told him that, and he admitted the case was strange enough that he'd flagged it for a state investigator who worked identity fraud cases spanning multiple counties, since Ashford wasn't the only small town along that stretch of highway with a pattern like this. 2 weeks later, that investigator called me directly. She told me they'd pulled security footage from a gas station near mile marker 214, the same spot where I'd picked up Perry, and the footage from roughly a year earlier showed a man matching my general build and coloring getting dropped off at that exact same shoulder, thumb out, waiting, the mirror image of how I'd found Perry. Except this time he was the one being picked up, not the one hitching a ride. She sent me a still frame from the footage. I stared at it for a long time on my kitchen table back home, and even accounting for the grainy quality, there was something in the set of the shoulders and the angle of the jaw that looked close enough to make my skin crawl. Close enough that a distracted waitress or a tired motel clerk glancing at a driver's license photo could easily be fooled. I have never gone back to find out what's inside that storage unit, and some nights I think that not knowing is worse than whatever I'd find, because whoever has been building a version of me out there for the better part of a year clearly isn't finished yet, and I have no idea what he's planning to do with everything he's collected under my name once the job, whatever it actually is complete. A few weeks after that call, the investigator sent one final piece of information, almost as an afterthought at the end of an otherwise routine update email. Ashford's small local paper had run a short community item 8 months earlier, the kind of filler piece papers run when there isn't much real news, congratulating a local photographer named C. Bell for having his wedding work featured in a regional bridal magazine. There was a photo credit attached. A blurry headshot, low resolution, clearly cropped from something else, of a man standing at an angle that hid most of his face except for the jaw and the shoulders, the same jaw and shoulders from the gas station footage. I called the magazine directly, gave them my real name, my real portfolio, my real client list going back 6 years. The editor who answered went quiet for a moment, then admitted, awkwardly, that they'd run a full spread crediting that photographer's work 2 issues earlier, and that several of the images, on closer inspection once I described my actual style and equipment, did look unusually familiar, close enough to make her nervous about a lawsuit she hadn't seen coming. She pulled the contact information they had on file for him. A phone number that, when I dialed it that same afternoon, connected to a voicemail box using my actual recorded greeting, the one I use for my real business line, word for word, down to the small stumble I always make over the word availability that I've never bothered to re-record. Whoever this is didn't just steal my name and my face. At some point, close enough to record it clearly, he had gotten a copy of my actual voice. I work as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized furniture company in Ohio. Every June, I do the same thing. I rent a house near the water for 1 week. I turn my phone on airplane mode for at least a few hours a day, and I try to remember what it feels like to not be tired. This year, I picked a place on Salt Cove Road, a narrow gravel street lined with identical gray shingled cottages about 40 feet apart from each other. The listing had 11 photos and 92 reviews, all 5 stars. I booked it in April. I didn't think about it again until I pulled into the driveway on a Friday afternoon in July. The house was smaller than the pictures made it look, but that's normal. What wasn't normal was the note taped to the inside of the front door. It said, in blue pen, "Welcome back." I stood there holding my suitcase, reading it twice. I had never been to this house before in my life. I figured it was a leftover note meant for a returning guest, something the cleaner forgot to take down. I peeled it off, folded it, and put it in the kitchen drawer with the takeout menus. I told myself it didn't mean anything. That's the kind of thing you tell yourself on day 1. The first 2 days were exactly what I wanted. I read on the porch. I ate cold shrimp out of a paper boat from a stand down the road. I didn't check my email once. Then, on Sunday night, around 11, I noticed the light in the house next door. It wasn't just on. It was pointed at my window, like someone had angled a lamp specifically toward my side of the property. I closed the blinds and told myself it was nothing. Old houses have old wiring. People leave lamps wherever. Monday morning, I found the first photograph. It was tucked under my windshield wiper. A printed photo, slightly warped from dew, of me sitting on the porch the night before, reading. Taken from a distance, through a zoom lens, from an angle that could only have come from the house next door. I called the property manager immediately. A woman named Carol answered, sounding rushed. I described the note, the light, the photo. She went quiet for a second too long before saying, "That house next door isn't a rental, it's private. I'll call the owner." She never called back that day. I texted twice. Nothing. That night I didn't sleep. I sat with the kitchen light off, watching the gap in the blinds, waiting to see if the lamp would turn again. At 12:40, it did. And this time, I saw a shape cross in front of it, a person standing still facing my house. I called the non-emergency police line. 2 officers came out around 1 in the morning, walked the property, knocked on the neighbor's door. Nobody answered. One of them told me, "Could just be a squatter. Places like this get them in the off-season." He said he'd noted in the log. That was it. Tuesday I tried to enjoy the beach, but I kept catching myself scanning the dune grass, checking for anyone with a camera. Around 4 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a notification from the rental app. A new message from host Salt Cove 7. It said, "Hope everything is comfortable. Let me know if the porch light is too bright at night." I hadn't mentioned the porch light to anyone. Not Carol, not the police. Nobody. I wrote back asking who this was, since Carol had always messaged me before. No reply. I decided I was leaving early. I started packing around 6, and that's when I found the second photo. This one slid halfway under the back door. It wasn't of me on the porch. It was of me packing, taken maybe 10 minutes earlier, through the bedroom window I hadn't thought to close the blinds on. Whoever this was, they were close enough to watch me in real time. I grabbed my keys and my suitcase, and I did not stop to get the rest of my things. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove straight to a gas station 2 miles down the road, where I sat under the fluorescent lights and called Carol again. This time she picked up. "I need to tell you something," she said. "That house next door, the owner is an older man named Walter. He used to own your rental too, years ago, before the company bought it from him. He kept a key. We've had 2 other complaints this summer. We didn't think it was serious enough to cancel bookings over. 2 other complaints. 2 other women probably, sitting exactly where I'd been sitting, finding notes taped to the inside of their door. I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since Friday. Why did the note say, 'Welcome back? I've never stayed there before'?" There was a pause. Then she said quietly, like she didn't want to say it out loud, "Your reservation. It says you booked under a returning guest account. Someone used your name and your card info to stay there 2 years ago under this exact same listing for the same week in July. I never made that reservation. I checked my bank statements going back 3 years that same night, sitting in a motel parking lot 40 minutes from Salt Cove Road. There it was. A charge from 2 summers ago, same company, same dates, same amount almost to the dollar, on a card I had reported stolen and replaced right around that time and never thought about again. I asked Carol to send me everything she had on the previous 2 bookings under that same guest profile, the ones from the past 2 summers I supposedly hadn't taken. She hesitated, said it wasn't standard practice to share another guest's information, then relented once I reminded her it was legally my own name on the account. What she sent me stopped me cold. 2 confirmation emails, both from the exact address I use for everything, my real inbox, the one I check daily. I dug back through my own archived mail and found them, buried under 2 years of unopened promotional junk, exactly where I would never have thought to look. I had never opened either one. The next morning, before I even checked out of the motel, I called the local police department in the town where Salt Cove Road sits, not the county line where I'd made my initial report the night before, and asked to speak with a detective rather than the on-call officer. A woman named Detective Reyes took my call. She asked me to describe Walter, the neighbor, in as much detail as I could remember from the 2 nights I'd caught him at the window. Her tone shifted partway through, careful, measured, the way people talk when they already know more than they're saying. She told me Walter had been the subject of a restraining order filed by a woman 2 summers earlier, the same summer as that first mystery reservation, though the woman had eventually dropped the case before it went to a hearing, citing exhaustion with the process rather than any change in circumstance. Detective Reyes said the case file listed the woman's rental address as the exact house I'd just fled. She wouldn't give me the woman's name, only confirmed that the pattern was, in her words, not new to us. I asked the only question that mattered by that point. Had that first woman, 2 summers ago, ever actually been the one to book the reservation, or had someone booked it for her the same way someone apparently booked it for me? Detective Reyes went quiet on the line for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said she couldn't confirm details of an open pattern of complaints, but she strongly encouraged me to change my banking information entirely, not just my card number, and to consider whether anyone close to me might have had access to my accounts 2 years ago, around the time the first reservation was made. I sat with that question the whole drive home. 2 years ago, I'd been dating someone I hadn't spoken to since, someone who used to joke, in the easy way people joke about things they mean partway seriously, that he wanted to take me somewhere quiet by the water someday. I never gave him access to my card information directly, but I did leave my laptop unlocked at his apartment more than once, back when I trusted him enough not to think about it. Someone had been booking that house in my name every summer since, and I had only just now been the one who actually showed up to claim it. My name is Sarah Whitfield, and I teach middle school science during the year, which is why every summer for the past 6 years, 4 of us from college have gone camping together at Loon Lake to decompress before the next school year starts. It's a 2-hour drive from civilization, no cell signal, just pine trees and water, and the same 5 campsites we've used since we were 22. This year, it was me, my husband Danny, and our friends Meg and Ollie. We got to our usual site, number 3, around 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday and started setting up like we always do. Ollie found the first strange thing while gathering firewood near the tree line behind our site. A backpack, half buried under pine needles, faded from years of weather, zipper rusted shut. Inside, once we pried it open, there was a water-damaged journal, a compass, and a driver's license belonging to a woman named Renee Castellano. Expiration date almost 9 years expired. None of us recognized the name. We joked about it being some old lost and found item, figured we'd drop it at the ranger station on the way out. That night around the fire, Meg brought up something odd. She said the campsite felt exactly the same as it had last year, which shouldn't have been strange, except she meant it too literally. The same broken branch angle over the fire pit. The same rock arrangement near the water. She said it felt like nobody had used the site since we left it 12 months ago, which was impossible. This was one of the most requested campsites at the lake. I brushed it off as her being tired from the drive. Around midnight, Danny noticed Ollie standing at the edge of the water, completely still, facing the lake, not responding when we called his name. When he finally turned around, he looked confused, said he didn't remember walking down there. He said the last thing he remembered was sitting by the fire 5 minutes earlier, but the fire had burned down to embers by then, meaning closer to an hour had passed. We laughed it off as him being tired. That's what you do at first. You look for the ordinary explanation before the strange one. The next morning, I opened the water-damaged journal from the backpack, hoping to find contact information so we could return it properly. Instead, I found entries, dated. The most recent entry was from a woman describing this exact campsite, describing a strange gap in her memory near the water, describing her friend acting strangely after a similar blackout. The entry ended mid-sentence. I looked up at Meg. She had gone very pale, because she recognized the description too. It matched almost exactly what had just happened to Ollie the night before. We decided to hike out early, cut the trip short, whatever this was. We didn't need to understand it, we just needed to leave. But hiking the trail back toward the car, Danny stopped cold at a bend near a shallow stream feeding into the lake. He pointed at the water. It had a strange, faint greenish shimmer along the edges, almost oily, almost glowing under the midday sun. I'm a science teacher. I recognized it eventually, once we got back to a place with signal and I could look it up. Certain algae blooms, under the right heat and stagnant conditions, release neurotoxins that don't kill you outright, but cause disorientation, short-term memory gaps, and hallucination. Like confusion in people who've been near the water source for extended periods, especially if it's been an unusually hot, dry summer with low water flow. Exactly the kind of summer we'd been having. That explained Ollie. That explained the missing woman's journal entry, probably. It didn't explain why the campsite looked untouched, or why Meg felt so certain nobody had used it in a year. We got back to the car around 3 in the afternoon and drove straight to the ranger station to drop off the backpack and report the water conditions. The ranger on duty took the backpack, looked at the license inside, and went unusually quiet. He said the name Renee Castellano matched an open missing persons case from 8 years earlier, a camper who vanished from that same lake and was never found. He asked us for the exact site number. We told him 3. He looked at his logbook, flipped back several pages, and told us that Site 3 had been closed to the public for the past 2 seasons due to unresolved contamination concerns, and that our reservation should never have gone through. I checked my phone that night once I had signal again, going back through my old photos from the trip we took last year at the same site, the one Meg swore felt untouched. In one of last year's photos, taken by the fire pit, there's a blurry shape near the tree line in the background that none of us noticed at the time. It's a backpack, the same backpack. Already sitting there, a full year before we ever found it. I couldn't let that go, so once school started back up in the fall, I used a free period to dig through the local newspaper archive our district subscribes to for research purposes, searching Renee Castellano's name against Loon Lake. What came up wasn't just the missing persons report. It was a follow-up article from about a year after her disappearance, describing a second camper, a man who had reported to rangers that he experienced a lost stretch of time near the same shallow stream, waking up disoriented on the shoreline with no memory of the previous several hours, and insisting, before rangers dismissed it as heat exhaustion, that he had seen someone standing in the shallows who matched Renee's description exactly, watching him, not moving, until he blinked and she was gone. I brought this to Danny that night, half expecting him to tell me I was spiraling over something. The algae bloom already explained well enough. Instead, he got quiet and pulled out his own phone, scrolling back through his camera roll to the exact same week last year, the trip Meg swore had felt untouched. He found a video he didn't remember taking, 40 seconds long, time-stamped at 2 in the morning, showing nothing but the dark tree line near our old campsite and the sound of his own breathing. Neither of us has any memory of him getting up that night to film it. I called the ranger station again in early September, spoke to the same ranger who'd told us about the closed site. I asked him directly whether the neurotoxin theory had ever actually been confirmed through water testing, or whether it was simply the explanation the department had settled on because it was easier to post warning signs about algae than to explain something they couldn't. He was honest with me in a way I didn't expect. He said water samples from that stream, tested twice over the past several years, had come back inconclusive both times, toxin levels present but not consistently at a threshold that should cause the kind of extended memory loss campers kept reporting. He told me one more thing before we hung up, something he said he probably shouldn't share, but felt like I deserved to know given everything I'd already found. Renee Castellano's last known entry into the park, according to the sign-in log rangers still keep at the trailhead, listed her destination as Campsite 3. The same site, the exact one we'd requested and somehow been given despite it supposedly being closed for 2 seasons. We haven't been back to Loon Lake since, and none of us have brought up going again, not even as a joke. But every June, right around the time we used to start planning the trip, Meg tells me she still dreams about the water, the same dream, every year, standing at the edge of that shallow stream watching someone walk toward her from the far shore, and every year, right before she wakes up, she says the person finally gets close enough for her to recognize the face, and every year, without fail, it's her own. I brought all of this to Danny privately one night after the kids I teach had already gone back to school, laying out the article, the ranger's admission about the inconclusive testing, Meg's recurring dream, hoping he'd tell me I was building a pattern out of coincidences, the way tired, anxious people sometimes do at the end of a long summer. Instead, he pulled up something on his laptop I hadn't seen, a state park incident log he'd requested under a public records request weeks earlier without telling any of us, quietly working the same angle I had been. The log went back 11 years and listed every reported medical or safety incident at Loon Lake by site number. Site 3 appeared 6 separate times. 2 of those were logged simply as disorientation resolved with no further detail. 1 was Renee Castellano's disappearance. 1 was the counselor incident from the older records Hal at Camp Birchwood might have recognized, though this was a different lake, a different state, and I had no reason yet to connect the two beyond the eerie symmetry of it. The remaining two were both, according to the notes column, reporting party declined further follow-up. The exact kind of quiet, unresolved language that had let Camp Birchwood bury its own lake for 30 years. Danny asked me the question I'd been avoiding since the trip ended. If Site 3 had this many documented incidents, closed twice, reopened twice, why would a private booking system let 4 ordinary campers reserve it at all this past summer? I didn't have an answer. Neither did the Park District when Danny called to ask directly. Only a vague explanation about a database syncing error between their closure list and their reservation software. An explanation that satisfied absolutely no one on that phone call, least of all the ranger who had to deliver it. We've since learned 2 other groups made the same reservation error this year alone, both assigned to Site 3 without realizing it was supposed to be closed, both reporting, when the district followed up as a formality, some version of the same disoriented, missing stretch of time near the water. The district finally removed the site from their online system entirely last month. Whether that actually keeps anyone out of it remains, as far as I'm concerned, an open question. What is my name does not matter for now. What matter actually is my job. I work in logistics for a shipping company, which means I spend 50 weeks a year staring at spreadsheets, so summer vacation matters to me more than most people. 2 years ago, my wife Claire and I rented a lake cabin in northern Michigan for a week. Found through a site that lets owners list their properties directly, no big company in between, which should have been our first warning sign. The listing was run by a man named Grant, responsive, polite, sent us a code for a lockbox on the porch. We arrived Saturday evening, let ourselves in, and the place looked exactly like the photos, clean, comfortable, a little dusty in the corners the way real cabins are. Sunday morning, Claire found a grocery list on the kitchen counter in handwriting that wasn't ours, dated the day before we arrived. Common enough, I figured. Cleaners sometimes leave things behind. We shrugged it off and went about our day. Monday, we came back from a hike to find the thermostat set differently than we'd left it, dropped from 72 to 68. Claire mentioned it, half joking, that maybe the cabin had a mind of its own. I checked the breaker box just to be thorough and found nothing unusual. Tuesday night is when things stopped being explainable. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the front door lock. I sat up, heart pounding, and by the time I got to the hallway, the door was locked again, undisturbed, like nothing had happened at all. Claire hadn't heard it. I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed it. Wednesday morning, I messaged Grant directly, asked if a cleaner had access during our stay. He said no, absolutely not. Nobody was scheduled to enter the property while we were booked. I told him about the sound at the door. He went quiet for almost 2 hours before responding, and when he did, his message felt carefully worded in a way that unsettled me more than an alarmed response would have. He said, "That cabin used to be co-owned with my brother. We split the property in the divorce settlement 2 years ago. He still might have an old key. I'll look into it. Co-owned. Divorce settlement. Old key." None of that had been in the listing. Wednesday night, Claire and I pushed the dresser in front of the bedroom door before going to sleep, which felt paranoid and also completely reasonable at the same time. Around 1 in the morning, we both heard it. Footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, stopping directly outside our door before retreating back toward the kitchen. I called the local sheriff's non-emergency line. A deputy came out, walked the property, found nothing, no forced entry, no sign of anyone. He suggested we were hearing the house settle, which might have been believable if it hadn't happened at almost the exact same time 2 nights in a row. Thursday, we found out the truth by accident. Claire struck up a conversation with a neighbor walking her dog past the property, mentioned we were renting the cabin for the week. The neighbor's face changed instantly. She said, "You know that's not really a rental, right? Grant's brother, Denny, he's been squatting there off and on since the divorce. He's harmless mostly, just doesn't understand. The place isn't his anymore. He still thinks of it as half his." Grant had been renting out a property he didn't have full, clear access to, and either didn't know or didn't care that his brother still let himself in whenever guests were staying there. Friday morning, we packed everything and left 2 days early, And on our way out, sitting on the porch railing, plainly visible, was a second set of keys we had never seen before, on a ring with a keychain shaped like a fish. The exact same fish keychain, we realized once we compared photos later, visible hanging in the background of one of the original listing photos, taken who knows how many guests ago. We left a review. Grant deleted the listing within a week of us posting it. 6 months later, out of curiosity, Claire searched the address online and found the exact same cabin relisted under a different name, different photos, same lockbox visible in one corner of a picture if you looked closely enough, and a fresh set of 5-star reviews from guests who clearly had no idea what they were walking into. I couldn't leave it there. I found the local county's property records office had digitized deed transfers going back 2 decades, so I searched the cabin's address directly. The divorce settlement Grant mentioned was real, filed 4 years earlier, splitting the property between him and a man listed as Dennis R. Marsh, no relation to me despite the shared last name, a detail that had rattled me slightly when I first saw it. But buried further down in the filing was something neither Grant nor the neighbor had mentioned. The court had actually awarded full, sole ownership of the cabin to Grant alone, with a specific clause barring Dennis from entering the property without written permission, dated 18 months before our stay. That meant Dennis hadn't been confused about the divorce at all. He'd been violating a legal order every single time he let himself in. And Grant, who managed the booking calendar and therefore knew exactly which weeks strangers would be sleeping there alone, had never once mentioned that restriction to us, or apparently to the sheriff's deputy who came out that Wednesday night. I called the sheriff's department back with the court filing in hand, and this time a different deputy took it seriously enough to pull Dennis's known address and pay him a visit. What they found, according to the follow-up call I eventually got 2 weeks later, was a small back room off the cabin's crawl space, accessible through a panel Dennis had installed himself years before the divorce, stocked with a cot, a lantern, and a spiral notebook filled with dated entries, not about the cabin, but about the guests. Physical descriptions, routines, what time people usually went to bed, how long they left the cabin unattended each day. Our entry was in that notebook too, dated the Saturday we arrived, describing Claire's laugh and my habit of checking the door twice before bed, details a stranger shouldn't have been close enough to know unless he'd been standing right outside our window listening. Dennis was never criminally charged with anything beyond the violation of the court order, since technically he was still a legal part owner of record until the paperwork fully processed, a loophole his lawyer apparently argued successfully enough to avoid trespassing charges. He was, however, barred permanently from the property this time, with an actual enforcement mechanism attached. Grant, notably, never once apologized, and to this day I don't know whether he genuinely didn't know his brother still had access, or whether a fully booked calendar every summer was worth more to him than warning strangers what they might hear outside their door at 1 a.m. What finally pushed me to write all of this down happened almost a year later, completely by accident. I was helping a coworker plan his own family trip and, half joking, told him the story of our lake cabin as a cautionary tale about booking through independent listing sites instead of larger platforms with more oversight. He laughed along until I mentioned the fish-shaped keychain, at which point his expression changed entirely. He pulled up a listing on his own phone, a different cabin, a different lake, 3 states away, and there it was in the corner of one photo, hanging from a hook near the back door, the same distinctive keychain, unmistakable once you've seen it once. I called the sheriff's department that had handled our case and gave them the new listing's information, more out of obligation than expectation that anything would come of it. A detective there eventually confirmed what I'd started to suspect. Dennis, barred from his brother's property, had apparently taken up informal work managing turnovers and maintenance for a small network of other independently listed cabins in the region, the kind of under-the-table arrangement that never shows up on paper, giving him legitimate physical access, keys included, to properties that had nothing to do with the divorce that started all of this. Whether he was actually letting himself into guests' rooms at any of those other properties, or whether the keychain was simply a habit he carried from job to job without thinking twice about it, nobody has been able to say for certain. What I do know is that somewhere out there, right now, another family is probably packing for a week at a cabin they found on a listing site, checking the photos one more time before they leave, and never once noticing the small, ordinary detail sitting quietly in the background of a picture that should have told them everything they needed to know. My name is Jonah Pierce, And after finishing grade school, I decided to spend the summer backpacking through Europe before starting a job I wasn't excited about. 3 weeks in, I was staying at a hostel in Prague, a converted old apartment building with narrow stairwells and a common room that smelled permanently like instant coffee. The front desk worker, a guy about my age named Tomas, took my passport at check-in to make a copy for their records, which is standard practice at most hostels. He returned it about 10 minutes later, apologizing for the delay, said the scanner was being slow. I didn't think about it again until 3 days later, when I tried to withdraw cash from an ATM near the river, and my card was declined. I called my bank from a payphone since my international plan barely worked, and the representative told me there had been a suspicious charge attempt in a country I wasn't currently in, using account information matching mine exactly. I brushed it off as random fraud, the kind that happens to everyone eventually, got a new card sent to a friend's address back home, and kept traveling. 5 days after that, at a different hostel in a different city, a fellow traveler named Elise mentioned she'd had almost the identical experience, a declined card, a fraud alert, right after staying at a hostel in Prague. Same city. When I asked which one, she named the exact same building I'd stayed in. That was too specific to be a coincidence. I messaged 2 other people I'd met briefly during my time in Prague, people I'd added on social media after a group dinner. One of them, a guy from Australia, responded almost immediately, said the same thing had happened to him too, fraud attempts on his card within a week of leaving that hostel. I decided to go back. Partly out of anger, partly because I needed to understand what was happening before it happened to someone else. I arrived in Prague again about 10 days later and walked straight to the hostel, only to find it had a new name on the sign outside, though the layout inside was unmistakably the same. Tomas wasn't at the front desk. A different employee was, a woman who introduced herself as Barbora. I explained what happened, showed her the fraud alerts on my banking app. She looked uncomfortable, glanced toward a back office before speaking. She said Thomas had been let go about a week earlier, quietly, without much explanation given to staff, and that management had specifically told everyone not to discuss why. I pushed. I told her about Elise, about the Australian guy, about the pattern. Something in her expression shifted, like she'd been holding something in and was relieved. Someone finally asked directly. She told me, in a low voice, that she'd found a small, handheld scanning device hidden behind the front desk computer monitor the day after Tomas left, something she didn't recognize, something she'd quietly turned over to the hostel's owner rather than police, out of fear it would shut the business down entirely if it became public. A passport and card skimmer hidden at the exact desk where every single guest handed over their documents for copying during check-in. I asked her what happened to the device now. She said the owner still had it, locked in a drawer, deciding what to do. I asked to see it, and after a long pause, she agreed, leading me to a small office behind the stairwell. The device was smaller than I expected, barely bigger than a phone, with a slot clearly designed to accept a passport page. Sitting next to it in the drawer, which the owner apparently hadn't gotten around to clearing out yet, was a small notebook filled with handwritten names, dates, and what looked like partial account numbers. I recognized 3 names on that list immediately. Mine, Elise's. The Australian guy's. There were over 60 names in that notebook, spanning almost 8 months. I photographed every page before Barbora nervously asked me to stop, worried about getting in trouble herself. I filed a report with Czech police the next morning, gave them everything I had, the photos, my own fraud alerts, Elise's contact information as a second witness. 2 months after I got home, an investigator reached out by email to inform me the case had identified Tomas as the primary suspect, but that he had left the country before they could make an arrest, using, according to their best information, a passport under a name that did not match any government record on file for him. Whoever he actually was, he'd been using our stolen identities to build a paper trail of his own, long before we ever noticed anything was wrong. Elise reached out to me again about a month after that email, saying an investigator had contacted her too, this time with a photograph pulled from a different hostel security camera in Budapest, taken almost a year before either of us had ever set foot in Europe. The man in the photo was unmistakably younger than the Tomas we'd both met, thinner, different haircut, but the eyes were the same, and so was a small scar above his left eyebrow that Elise remembered noticing during a conversation about a childhood bike accident he'd told her about, a detail too specific and too personal to be coincidence. That meant whoever this actually was had been running the same setup for years, moving from hostel to hostel across multiple countries under different names, staying just long enough at each one to gain access to a front desk and a stack of passports before something forced him to relocate, whether suspicion, a near miss with police, or simply the natural end of a seasonal contract. I asked the investigator, during a follow-up call 2 months later, how many names total they'd managed to connect back to him across every location they'd identified. She wouldn't give me an exact figure, only that the number was, in her words, significant enough that we believe this has funded a substantial portion of his movement for several years, and that my case, along with Elise's and the Australian travelers, had actually helped connect dots between two previously unrelated investigations in two different countries. What unsettles me most, even now, isn't the fraud itself, or the money, most of which the bank eventually reimbursed. It's the notebook, 60 names, written by hand, in a drawer he clearly meant to come back for. I think about the version of that notebook still sitting somewhere, maybe in a new city under a new name, filling up again with people who handed over their passports without a second thought, the same way I did, because that's simply what you do at a front desk, because you have no reason yet to think anyone would use trust like that against you. I went back to Prague once more the following summer, mostly for closure, staying at a completely different hostel across the river this time. On my last night, killing time at a small pub near the old town square, I struck up a conversation with a backpacker from Canada who mentioned, unprompted, that he'd had his card flagged for fraud a week after staying somewhere on the other side of the city, a place he described with enough detail that I felt my stomach drop before he even finished the sentence. Different name. Different neighborhood entirely from where I'd stayed. Same story. I gave him the investigator's contact information before we parted ways that night, and out of my own stubborn need to finish something I'd started, I emailed her again the next morning with the new location. She wrote back within a day, this time with something closer to real news than any update she'd given me before. Interpol had connected a man matching Tomas's general description, using yet another alias, to a similar skimming operation broken up in Krakow just 2 months earlier, and forensic accountants tracing the money were beginning to see a pattern of small, regular transfers routed through several accounts before eventually landing, oddly, in a legitimate-looking business registered as a travel consulting firm. She couldn't tell me whether that meant an arrest was close, only that the case had grown large enough now that it had its own dedicated task force spanning 3 countries. I think about that 60-name notebook constantly, and I think now, knowing what I know, that the real number, spread across every city, every hostel, every alias, is probably closer to several hundred people who handed a stranger their passport across a front desk and never gave it a second thought, exactly the way I didn't, right up until I had every reason to. The last thing the investigator ever told me, almost a year after that first phone call from Ashford, was that the travel consulting firm receiving those small regular transfers had, in a strange twist neither of us saw coming, actually been operating legally on paper for over 3 years, filing taxes, listing an office address, appearing in... Someone had built an entire legitimate shell around the theft, patient enough to let it run quietly in the background while feeding it a slow, steady drip of other people's stolen information. I think about that front desk in Prague sometimes, the narrow stairwell, the smell of instant coffee, and I think about how ordinary the whole thing felt in the moment, how Thomas apologized so easily for the slow scanner, how none of it registered as strange until 3 separate strangers in 3 separate cities discovered they'd all handed the same hand their entire identity without a second thought. I took a job as a counselor at Camp Birchwood, a sleepaway camp in the Adirondacks I'd actually attended myself as a kid almost 10 years earlier. It felt nostalgic to go back, familiar dirt paths, the same dining hall smell, the same lake. I was assigned Cabin 9, a group of 8 10-year-old girls. On my first night doing the cabin check-in, one of the campers, a quiet girl named Ruthie, asked me a strange question. She asked if it was true that a girl had drowned in Cabin 9's group a long time ago. I told her I'd never heard anything like that, figured it was just camp legend, the kind every sleepaway camp seems to have. Older counselors get a kick out of scaring the younger campers with ghost stories. I didn't think much of it. 3 days into the session, I mentioned the question to another counselor, a returning staff member named Priya, expecting her to laugh it off. Instead, she got quiet, said, "Don't bring that up around the directors." Seriously, just don't. That reaction unsettled me more than any ghost story would have. I let it go for about a week, focused on my actual job, swim lessons, campfire songs, the usual. Then, during a free period, while looking for extra art supplies in a storage closet behind the main office, I found a box of old camper files, physical folders from years before digital records, clearly meant to be archived somewhere and forgotten instead. I wasn't supposed to be looking through them, I knew that, but curiosity got the better of me. I found a folder for a camper from 12 years earlier assigned to Cabin 9. Her emergency contact information had a red stamp across it that simply said, "Incident, closed." No further detail in the folder itself. I asked around carefully, trying not to draw attention, and eventually one of the camp's longtime maintenance workers, an older man named Hal who'd been there for over 20 years, told me the story off the record while we were fixing a dock board together. A camper had drowned during a swim test in the lake, Cabin 9, exactly as Ruthie had said. The camp had settled quietly with the family, restructured the swim program the following year, and made an unofficial rule that the story was never to be discussed with new staff or campers, to avoid scaring families away from a camp with an otherwise spotless reputation. That explained the legend. It didn't explain what happened 4 days later. During a routine swim test, one of my own campers, a girl named Devon, went under for a moment longer than she should have during a required lap, long enough that I dove in myself before the lifeguard even reacted. She came up coughing but fine, scared more than hurt. What unsettled me afterward was something Devon said once she caught her breath, sitting wrapped in a towel on the dock. She said she felt someone's hand on her ankle underwater pulling her down right before I reached her. There was no one near her in the water. I had watched the whole lane myself. I reported the incident to the camp director immediately, expecting real concern. Instead, I was met with a strange calm, almost rehearsed, the director saying these things happen. Kids panic during swim tests. It's a normal reaction to inhaling water. She specifically asked me not to write up the ankle detail in the incident report, said it would only alarm parents unnecessarily. That request told me everything I needed to know about how they'd handled the story 12 years earlier too. I quietly pulled Hal aside again that evening and asked him directly what actually happened to the girl who drowned, whether there had been any question about how it happened, not just that it happened. He hesitated a long time before telling me the girl's swim buddy, another camper, had come forward afterward saying she felt someone grab her own ankle just before her friend went under, but that a 10-year-old's account, understandably, was dismissed entirely by everyone involved as a traumatized child's confused memory. I finished out the summer because I didn't want to abandon my cabin of girls, but I never let any of them swim without me in the water beside them for the rest of the session. I resigned before the following summer and never went back. 3 years later, scrolling through a local news alert completely by accident, I saw that Camp Birchwood had quietly closed its swim program entirely, citing updated safety protocols, after another unexplained near-drowning incident involving a different cabin altogether. The article didn't mention the cabin number. I didn't need it to. I reached out to Hal one more time that same week, this time by phone, because something about the timing of the closure gnawed at me, and I needed to know if it was connected to what happened with Devon. He confirmed it was, said the second near-drowning that summer had involved a boy in a different cabin entirely, Cabin 4, on the opposite side of the lake, which told me whatever was happening wasn't tied to one specific building or one unlucky stretch of shoreline the way I'd almost convinced myself it was. He also told me something he said he'd been sitting on since I left, something he hadn't felt right sharing while I was still working there in case it scared me into quitting mid-season and leaving my girls without a counselor. The original camper who drowned 12 years ago wasn't the first incident at that lake at all. Records the camp kept privately, separate from anything a parent would ever see, showed a similar drowning nearly 30 years before that. A young counselor that time, not a camper, pulled from the water by two others who both independently reported the same sensation of being grabbed from below just before they lost their grip on her. 2 incidents, decades apart, both involving someone insisting they felt a hand where no hand should have been. Camp Birchwood had rebuilt its swim program twice, renamed its cabins once, and never once, according to Hal, actually drained and inspected the lake bed itself in all the years he'd worked there, because doing so would have meant admitting, on paper, that something about that stretch of water needed explaining beyond bad luck. I think about Devon sometimes, grown now, probably in high school, hopefully with no memory of that afternoon at all. I think about Ruthie, who asked her question on the very first night like she already half knew the answer before I gave her mine. And I think about the fact that whatever closed that swim program for good wasn't a policy decision made in a boardroom somewhere far from the lake. It was made because, for the third time that anyone had bothered to document, a hand reached up from beneath the surface and nobody could prove whose it was. 2 years after I left, I got an unexpected message on social media from a woman named Carla who introduced herself as the mother of the boy from Cabin 4, the second near drowning that finally forced the swim program closure. She'd found my name through a mutual connection, another former counselor, after asking around trying to piece together whether the camp had a longer history than the vague safety language in her son's incident report suggested. I told her everything I knew, including what Hal had shared with me about the counselor from 30 years earlier. She went quiet for a long stretch before responding, then told me something that made the whole thing feel suddenly much larger than I'd let myself imagine. Her son, in the weeks after his near drowning, had mentioned almost the exact same detail Devin told me on that dock, a hand around his ankle, except he'd added something Devin never had. He said the hand felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with lake water, and that right before he felt it, he heard, very clearly, a girl's voice say a name that wasn't his. Carla had never told anyone that part, worried it would sound like she was coaching her son into a story for a lawsuit that never actually materialized. But she'd written the name down anyway, tucked into her phone's notes app the same night he told her, just in case it ever mattered. She sent me a screenshot. The name matched the girl who drowned 12 years earlier, the one from the folder I found in that storage closet, word for word, spelled exactly the way it appeared on her old camper registration form. A detail that had never been made public in any article, any settlement, any piece of local reporting either of us could find. There was no way for a 9-year-old boy from a different state, a different generation of campers entirely, to have known that name unless something at that lake had decided, for reasons neither of us can explain, that it wanted it said out loud again. My name is Nathan Cole, and I work remotely as a software developer, which means I can technically work from anywhere with decent internet. So last August, I booked a mountain cabin through a private rental app for 2 weeks, planning to work mornings and hike afternoons. The cabin, listed as Cabin 12, Ridgeline Retreat, had a wall of windows facing a valley view, which is exactly why I picked it. The host, a man who went by R. Danvers in messages, was quick to respond, professional, gave detailed check-in instructions. My first few days were uneventful. I worked, I hiked, I sat on the deck at night looking at stars I never get to see back in the city. On day 4, adjusting a wall-mounted television that seemed slightly crooked, I noticed something small and black tucked into the corner of the frame behind it. A camera, no bigger than a coin, its tiny lens angled directly out into the living room. My stomach dropped. I checked the smoke detectors next, a common hiding spot I'd read about once in an article about rental scams. Sure enough, one in the hallway had a lens where the sensor should have been. I found 3 more over the next hour, methodically checking every room. One in the bedroom, positioned toward the bed. One in the bathroom vent. One in a decorative clock on the kitchen wall. I didn't touch any of them. I called the rental app support line, explained everything, and was told a specialist would call back within 24 hours, which felt insultingly slow given what I'd just found. That night, I unplugged the cabin's main router entirely, figuring at minimum I could cut off any live feed, and slept with a chair wedged against my bedroom door, same instinct anyone would have. The next morning, I found a printed note slipped under the front door, no envelope, just a folded page. It read, "Please reconnect the Wi-Fi. The system needs it to run properly. Thank you for staying at Ridgeline Retreat." Nothing threatening in the wording itself, but the fact that someone had walked up to the cabin overnight and left it close enough to my sleeping location to slide paper under a locked door chilled me more than any of the cameras had. I called the local sheriff's department immediately, reported everything, the cameras, the note. 2 deputies came out within the hour, photographed each device, bagged them as evidence. One deputy told me quietly that this wasn't the first complaint about a cabin in this specific rental cluster, that they'd had 2 similar reports over the past year, both dismissed at the time due to lack of physical evidence, since the guests hadn't found the cameras before checking out and moving on with their trip. The property, according to county records the deputy pulled up on his laptop in his patrol car, was registered to a holding company, not an individual, making it difficult to trace directly to R. Danvers, who turned out to be a name with no actual public record attached to it at all. I packed up and left that afternoon, staying in a motel in town instead for the remainder of my trip, filing a formal complaint with the rental app, who eventually removed the listing 3 weeks later after what they called an internal investigation, language vague enough to tell me they weren't planning to say much more. About a month after I got home, doing a search out of morbid curiosity, I found the exact same cabin relisted on a different rental platform under a new name. Cabin 12 changed to Ridgeline Hideaway, new photos taken from slightly different angles, but the same crooked television mount clearly visible in one of them, the same decorative clock still hanging on the kitchen wall. I reported it again. It took another 6 weeks to come down that time. What stays with me isn't the cameras themselves. It's the note. Someone walked up to that cabin in the dark, close enough to touch the door I was sleeping behind, and instead of running, instead of confronting me, they left a polite request and walked calmly back into the trees. I kept the deputy's business card from that first night, and about 10 weeks after I got home, curious whether the investigation had gone anywhere, I called to check in. He remembered the case immediately and told me something the department hadn't shared with me at the time because it was still being confirmed. The tiny cameras I'd found weren't just recording locally to be collected later. They'd been transmitting to a live stream server, active in real time, accessible through a private link that investigators eventually traced to a paid subscription service used by a small but dedicated group of members, all of whom had been watching Cabin 12 and presumably other properties in that same rental cluster for months. The deputy said the holding company behind the property was a shell, registered through a filing agent 2 states away, common enough for legitimate rental businesses trying to limit liability, but in this case deliberately structured to make tracing, R. Danvers, back to a real person nearly impossible without a court order that took months to secure. When they finally got one, the name attached to the original filing turned out to belong to a man who had died 6 years earlier, his identity apparently used, illegally, as a kind of permanent shield for whoever was actually running the operation. They never found him. What they did find, once they finally got a warrant to search a storage facility connected to the shell company, was equipment for at least 11 other properties, all across 3 states, all rigged the same way, all still active and streaming as of the day of the raid. I think about that note under the door more than I think about the cameras themselves, because the cameras were impersonal, mechanical, the kind of violation you can almost rationalize as distant and abstract. The note wasn't. Someone stood inches from where I slept, chose their words carefully enough to sound harmless, and calculated that a polite request would unsettle me less than a threat would, which meant they understood exactly how frightened people behave and had clearly had plenty of practice getting it right. Months later, out of a curiosity I couldn't quite let go of, I reached out to the subscription streaming service's abandoned support email, one still technically listed on an archived version of their site even after the operation was shut down, using a throwaway account and a vague inquiry about renewing access. I never expected a response. I got one anyway, 3 days later, from an automated system that hadn't been fully decommissioned, listing the properties still theoretically available under active subscriptions, including one labeled simply Ridgeline 12 Premium Tier, alongside a note that Premium Tier subscribers receive priority access to properties with what the listing bluntly called extended viewing windows, meaning I can only assume. I forwarded that immediately to the deputy, who told me the server itself had already been seized as evidence, meaning the note I'd received had come from some kind of orphaned backup system. Nobody had thought to shut down completely, a ghost of the operation still running quietly in the background months after the raid. What haunts me isn't just that people paid to watch strangers sleep and work and live inside a cabin they trusted enough to rent. It's the phrase, extended viewing windows. Clinical, businesslike, the language of a company optimizing a product, applied to something that had nothing to do with a product at all. I think about the 11 other properties they found equipment for, and I wonder how many of those guests are like me, home safely now, never having found the cameras at all, going about their lives with no idea that somewhere, someone paid a subscription fee for the privilege of watching them unpack their suitcase. I don't work remotely from rental cabins anymore, not the way I used to. I stick to hotel chains now, the kind with corporate oversight and enough bad press potential that a scandal like this would actually cost someone something real. It feels like an overreaction some days, and then I remember the note under the door, the careful, unthreatening wording of it, and I remind myself that overreacting is a much easier thing to live with than finding a 5th camera I somehow missed. A friend asked me recently why I still check smoke detectors and wall clocks out of habit wherever I stay, even in places with obvious corporate branding and a front desk staffed around the clock. I told him the truth. It only takes finding one small black lens once, hidden somewhere ordinary, to understand that ordinary is exactly where you should have been looking the whole time, and that the feeling never fully goes away once you know it. My name is Kayla, and every summer since college, 4 of us from the same friend group meet up for a week at a rental house near the boardwalk in Ocean Grove. This year, it was me, Britt, Simone, and our friend Ashley, who none of us had seen in person for almost 2 years since she moved out west. Ashley arrived a day after the rest of us, and the second she walked in, something felt slightly off, though I couldn't place what. Her laugh was the same. Her stories about her new job were the same. But small things nagged at me, the way she ordered her coffee differently than she used to, the way she seemed unfamiliar with an inside joke the 4 of us had shared since sophomore year of college. I told myself 2 years changes people. I let it go. The second night, Britt brought up an old memory from a spring break trip years earlier, expecting Ashley to laugh along like she always had. Ashley just smiled blankly and said, "Oh yeah, that was wild," in a way that felt performed rather than remembered. Simone noticed too, mentioned it to me privately while we were getting ice from the machine down the hall. She said Ashley's face in real life looked almost imperceptibly different from her recent photos online, something about the eyes, though she admitted it could just be a filter thing. Everyone's photos look different from real life now. On the third day, while Ashley was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the counter with a text preview visible on the lock screen. It read, "Don't slip up on the shared memories, stick to the vague ones." I stared at it, unsure I'd read it right, and by the time I picked the phone up to look closer, the screen had already gone dark and locked. I didn't say anything to her directly. Instead, that night, I quietly messaged Ashley's mother, someone I'd known since we were kids, on a completely separate platform, just checking in casually, asking how she was doing, mentioning we were all together for the week. Her mother responded almost immediately, confused. She said Ashley hadn't spoken to her in nearly 8 months, that the 2 of them had a falling out, and that as far as she knew, Ashley was still living in Colorado, not on the East Coast at all. I showed Britt and Simone the message with shaking hands. We stepped outside onto the porch to talk quietly, trying to figure out what to do, when Ashley came out to join us, asking what was wrong. Simone, thinking fast, said we were just talking about an old professor. Ashley laughed at a joke Simone made up on the spot about a professor that never existed, laughing exactly like she was supposed to, in on a memory that wasn't real. That confirmed it for all 3 of us at once. We didn't confront her that night, too afraid of what she might do if she realized we knew. Instead, Britt quietly called the real Ashley's phone number the next morning while Ashley was out getting coffee. It rang twice and went to a full voicemail box, unable to accept new messages. We drove to the local police station that afternoon under the excuse of a boardwalk shopping trip, filed a report explaining everything: the mismatched memories, the strange text, the mother's confusion, the full voicemail box on a number that should have belonged to our actual friend. An officer took it seriously enough to run the woman's photo against the database once we returned to the house with a photo pulled discreetly from her social media that morning. Within 2 days, detectives confirmed her real identity. A woman with a documented pattern of inserting herself into friend groups of people she'd researched extensively online, often people going through public falling outs with family, exploiting the gap in communication to convincingly step into their life for days or weeks at a time, usually targeting group trips where cash, shared expenses, and access to personal belongings made the deception profitable. The real Ashley, detectives eventually confirmed after tracking her down, was safe, simply unreachable during a stretch without cell service on a remote work trip, completely unaware that someone had been living her social life in her absence for almost a week. What none of us can explain, even now, is how the woman knew details about our specific inside jokes closely enough to almost pass, details that weren't posted publicly anywhere we could find, meaning she had access to something more private than any of us have been able to trace back to its source. Detectives eventually gave us a partial answer, though not one that made any of us feel better. The woman, whose real name turned out to be Dana Whitfield, had spent nearly 3 months before the trip building what investigators called a full social profile on Ashley, not just scraping public posts, but purchasing access to a data broker service that aggregates old, deleted, and supposedly private content scraped from platforms years earlier. The kind of service marketed to advertisers and quietly available to anyone willing to pay for it. Old photo captions Ashley had deleted in college. A now-defunct blog she'd kept for exactly one semester. Comments on other people's posts that mentioned the four of us by name, including, it turned out, an old comment thread under a photo from that very trip Britt had brought up, the one where Ashley's blank reaction gave her away in the first place. Dana had actually read the comments under that photo. She simply hadn't accounted for the fact that reading about a memory and having lived it produced two very different reactions when someone brings it up unprompted at a dinner table. Detectives found evidence she had done this before, at least twice, both times targeting people going through a documented estrangement from family or friends, both times inserting herself into a group setting where shared expenses and casual access to belongings made the deception financially worthwhile over the course of just a few days. In one earlier case, a family in Georgia had unknowingly paid for a full week of a stranger's hotel stay, meals, and a rental car deposit before anyone realized the cousin who'd shown up for a reunion wasn't actually related to them at all. The real Ashley, once we finally reached her, laughed at first when we told her, assuming it was some kind of joke, and then went quiet for a long time once she understood we were serious. She told us, almost apologetically, that she'd posted more online during her falling out with her mother than she'd realized, venting late at night the way people do, never once imagining that a stranger would read every word of it closely enough to become her for the better part of a week. Better, in some uncomfortable moments, than we apparently knew her ourselves. The financial side of it took even longer to untangle than the emotional side did. Dana had used a card under Ashley's real name, obtained through the same data broker research, to cover her share of the beach house for the week, meaning that for months afterward, the actual Ashley was fighting a fraud dispute with her bank over a charge she never authorized, for a trip she never took, at a house she'd never even seen. It took a signed statement from all three of us, plus the police report, before the bank finally reversed it. Britt, who had been closest to Ashley growing up, took it hardest once the shock wore off into something quieter and more unsettled. She told me, weeks later, that the part she couldn't shake wasn't the fraud or even the fake laugh at dinner. It was a moment on the boardwalk the second night, before any of us suspected anything, when Dana had reached over and fixed a strand of Britt's hair, the exact way the real Ashley used to, an unconscious, specific little gesture none of us had ever seen described anywhere online. The kind of thing you'd only know from actually spending time with someone in person. When Britt finally asked the real Ashley about it months later, half expecting a mundane explanation, Ashley went quiet on the phone for a long moment before admitting she genuinely didn't know where that habit came from either, that she'd apparently been doing it since childhood without ever noticing, which meant Dana hadn't learned it from anything Ashley had ever posted, said, or written anywhere Dana could plausibly have accessed. None of us have an explanation for that one detail, and it's the piece of the whole ordeal that none of us bring up anymore, not even among ourselves, because every theory we've tried leads somewhere we'd rather not think about too closely. I teach high school history, which is probably why I was the one in my family who insisted we actually use the old farmhouse my grandfather left us instead of selling it right away like my sister wanted. Last summer, my wife Rachel and our two kids drove out to spend 2 weeks there, the first time anyone in the family had stayed overnight in the place since my grandfather passed almost a year earlier. The house sat on 11 acres outside a small town in rural Missouri, the kind of place with one stoplight and a gas station that closes at 9. My grandfather had lived there alone for decades after my grandmother passed, and the house had that particular stillness of a place that's been waiting for someone. The first few days were quiet, cleaning out closets, sorting through decades of accumulated belongings. My daughter, 7 years old, mentioned on our second night that she heard someone walking around downstairs after we put her to bed. I checked, found nothing, chalked it up to an old house settling and a kid's imagination in an unfamiliar place. On the fourth day, going through my grandfather's old desk in the study, I found a locked metal box in the bottom drawer, no key anywhere obvious. I set it aside, figuring I'd deal with it later, and went back to sorting paperwork. That night, Rachel woke me up around 2 in the morning, certain she'd heard a sound coming from beneath the floorboards in the hallway, not from another room, but from directly below the house. I told her it was probably the old furnace cycling on, an explanation that satisfied neither of us fully, but was easier to accept at 2 in the morning than the alternative. The next afternoon, while my son was playing in the yard, he came running inside excited, saying he found a metal grate half hidden behind an overgrown hedge near the side of the house, leading down into some kind of underground space. I went to look, found an old cellar entrance clearly sealed at some point with a heavy padlock, rusted but intact. I mentioned it to a neighbor, an older woman named Dot who'd known my grandfather for over 40 years, when she stopped by to welcome us to the property. Her expression shifted the moment I described the cellar. She said my grandfather had that entrance sealed off almost 20 years ago and never let anyone, family included, go down there again after that, though she claimed not to know exactly why, just that something had changed in him around that time, made him more private, more guarded about the property. That night, the sound under the floorboards came again, closer this time, more distinct, like something shifting rather than settling. My daughter, sleeping in the room above what I now realized was roughly positioned over that same sealed cellar space, woke up crying, saying she heard someone say her name from under her bed. I moved both kids into our room for the rest of the night, told myself it was coincidence. An old house, an unfamiliar environment, a child's overactive imagination feeding off her brother's earlier discovery of the cellar door. The next morning, I finally broke into the locked metal box from my grandfather's desk using a screwdriver, curiosity outweighing patience at that point. Inside were old photographs, deeds, and a folded letter addressed to no one specifically, written in my grandfather's handwriting, undated. The letter described, in careful, deliberate language, a man named Kurt who had worked on the farm decades earlier, who my grandfather described as having gone missing after the incident, a phrase never fully explained in the letter itself, followed by a single line that made my hands go cold. It said, "I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what's really under this house, so I sealed it, and I'll keep sealing it as long as I'm able." I called Dot back that same afternoon, read her the letter over the phone. There was a long silence before she finally admitted, reluctantly, that there had been rumors decades ago about a farmhand who disappeared suddenly. Rumors that were never investigated seriously at the time because the family who owned the land, my family, had significant standing in the small community, enough that questions tended to quietly disappear along with the people they were asked about. I called the county sheriff's department that evening, explained the letter, the sealed cellar, my grandfather's cryptic wording. 2 deputies came out 3 days later with proper equipment to open the padlock legally and document whatever was found. I won't describe everything they found down there. Some of it is still part of an active investigation, and some of it I genuinely wish I didn't know. What I will say is that the sounds under the floorboards stopped completely the same day the cellar was finally opened, after 20 years of staying quiet. What still keeps me up some nights isn't what they found. It's that my daughter, 7 years old, with no possible way of knowing any of this history beforehand, described the voice under her bed as sounding like it was saying, over and over, a name. The deputies confirmed it during their investigation days later. It matched the name in my grandfather's letter exactly. The investigation stretched on for almost 4 months after that first visit from the sheriff's department, during which we stayed in a motel in town rather than the farmhouse, unwilling to let the kids anywhere near the property until we had answers. A detective named Fallon, who ended up leading the case, called me periodically with updates, careful, measured, never giving me more than what was already confirmed. What they eventually pieced together, partly from the cellar itself and partly from county records going back decades, was that Kurt hadn't simply vanished the way local rumor had always assumed. He'd worked the farm for nearly 6 years under my grandfather before a dispute broke out between the 2 men over unpaid wages. A dispute Kurt had apparently threatened to take to the county, along with what he claimed was proof my grandfather had been underreporting income from the farm for years to avoid certain taxes. A small, ordinary kind of dishonesty that, exposed in a town that size at that time, would have quietly ruined the family's standing for a generation. Detective Fallon was careful never to say the word directly to me on the phone, but the physical evidence recovered from the cellar, combined with a timeline built from farmhand pay records and a neighbor's account of hearing raised voices near the property the same week Kurt was last seen, left very little room for another explanation. My grandfather had built more than his standing on that land. He'd built it on something he sealed beneath his own house and lived above for the next 20 years, close enough to hear, apparently, whatever it was that our daughter heard too. I asked Fallon once, near the end of the investigation, whether he'd ever worked a case where a structure seemed to hold on to something the way people describe old houses doing in stories, and he gave me the kind of careful, professional non-answer detectives give when they don't want to speculate on the record. But off the record, standing in our motel parking lot the last time we met in person to sign paperwork, he told me his own daughter had asked to go home early. The one time he'd brought her along to walk the property during daylight for no reason she could explain beyond the house. In her words, not liking that we were there. We sold the land within the year. Neither Rachel nor I could bring ourselves to set foot back inside that farmhouse even once, not even to collect the last of my grandfather's belongings, which we ultimately paid a estate company to clear out for us. My daughter has never brought up the voice again on her own, and we've never asked her to. But sometimes, when the house comes up unavoidably in conversation with family, she goes quiet in a way that makes it clear she remembers exactly what she heard and exactly whose name it was saying, even as she's decided, on her own, at 7 years old, that some things are better left unsaid out loud a second time. I teach history for a living, which means I spend my working life explaining to teenagers that the past doesn't stay buried just because a family decides not to talk about it, that silence is its own kind of decision with its own kind of consequences, sometimes decades later, sometimes to people who had absolutely nothing to do with the original choice. I never expected to learn that lesson so literally, in my own family, under my own inherited roof, in a cellar my grandfather sealed rather than faced. I think about him sometimes, an old man alone in that farmhouse for 20 years, listening to whatever my daughter eventually heard too, and choosing every single day to stay anyway rather than tell anyone the truth. I run a moderately popular travel blog, the kind that pays for itself through partnerships with hotels and cruise lines in exchange for honest reviews. Last June, a mid-sized line called Meridian Waves comped me a 7-night Caribbean cruise in exchange for coverage. I said yes without thinking twice. Free is free. I boarded in Miami on a Sunday, checked into my cabin on Deck 7, and spent the first 2 days doing what I always do, photographing food, photographing sunsets, tagging my exact location in every post because that's what my followers expect and what the sponsorship required. On the third night, I met a woman named Holly at the pool bar. She was traveling alone too, celebrating a divorce, she joked. We had a couple of drinks, exchanged numbers, agreed to meet for breakfast the next morning. She never showed up. I texted her a few times, figured she'd overslept or found better company. By dinner, I asked one of the crew if they'd seen her. The woman's expression shifted just slightly, professional composure snapping briefly back into place. She said she'd check the passenger list and get back to me. She never did. The next morning, an announcement came over the ship intercom about an unscheduled safety drill, requiring all passengers to report to their muster stations for a head count. It felt routine, until I noticed the crew doing something they hadn't done during the actual official drill on day 1. They were cross-checking names against room numbers with unusual intensity, radios crackling constantly. I asked a crew member directly if this was about a missing passenger. He glanced around before answering quietly that a woman had been reported not present in her cabin that morning, and that ship policy required this kind of drill before making any official announcement to avoid, in his words, causing alarm. Holly's cabin, I later learned by chance from a housekeeping cart schedule taped near the elevator, was 2 doors down from mine. That afternoon, I did what any blogger with an audience does. I posted about it carefully, not naming her, just describing the strange drill and asking if anyone else on board had noticed something off. Within an hour, a woman I didn't know direct messaged me. She said her sister had sailed on this exact ship 4 months earlier and had also gone missing, that Meridian Waves quietly settled with her family for an undisclosed amount, and that the case had never been reported to the Coast Guard as a criminal matter, only logged as a presumed accidental fall. 4 months. Same ship. A pattern starting to take shape. I went to guest services and asked to speak with the staff captain directly. I was told he was unavailable, offered a complimentary spa credit instead, which felt so wildly out of place with what I was asking about that it actually scared me more than a denial would have. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, I heard someone testing the handle of my cabin door, slow, careful, clearly trying not to make noise. I looked through the peephole and saw a crew member in an unmarked uniform standing there, not knocking, just standing, before eventually walking away. The next morning, I found out why. A staff member I'd become friendly with over the week, a bartender named Marcus, pulled me aside during a smoke break on the lower deck and told me quietly that ships like this one carry enormous liability insurance and that certain incidents at sea, if they can be classified as accidental, cost the company almost nothing, while a murder investigation would cost them everything, including their maritime operating license in several ports. He said there had been whispers among the crew for over a year about a pattern nobody wanted to say out loud. He also told me something that made my stomach drop entirely. He said crew had noticed I'd been geotagging my exact cabin location and daily schedule publicly online since day one of the trip, something Holly had also done on her own social media, according to the sister who'd messaged me. I deleted every location tag from my account that same hour, sitting on the floor of my cabin with the door double locked and a chair wedged under the handle. We docked back in Miami 2 days later. I filed a report with the FBI's Maritime Crimes Unit as soon as I got signal, laid out everything: the missing passenger, the sister's message, Marcus's account. An agent called me back within a week and confirmed there were at least 3 unresolved disappearances tied to that specific ship over 18 months, all young women traveling alone, all active on social media, all posting their exact location throughout the trip. 2 months after I got home, I got a message request on Instagram from an account with no posts and no profile picture. It contained a single photo: a hallway on deck 7, taken from just outside a cabin door. My cabin door. I forwarded it immediately to the FBI agent handling my report, and she called me within the hour, her voice more urgent than it had been in any of our previous conversations. She asked me to preserve the message exactly as it was, not to reply, not to block the account yet, since a reply or a block could tip off whoever sent it that I'd noticed. She said their team had been quietly building a case against a small group of crew members suspected of identifying vulnerable solo travelers during the cruise itself, tracking their public social media activity for weeks or months after disembarking, and, in at least one prior instance, using photos exactly like this one as a kind of message, a way of letting a target know they were still being watched long after they thought the danger had ended. She asked if I still had any of my original geotagged posts from the cruise saved anywhere, even deleted ones, since metadata could sometimes be recovered and used to build a clearer picture of who had access to that information and when. I did. I'd kept drafts of nearly every caption in my phone's notes app out of habit, something I do for every trip so I can reuse language for future posts. Comparing the timestamps against Marcus's account of the ship's staffing schedule, the agent found something that made the case feel suddenly, horribly concrete. Every single time I had posted my exact cabin number or a photo clearly showing my hallway, it lined up within minutes with a shift change for one specific crew member, a security officer whose job legitimately required badge access to every deck, including mine, at any hour of the night. They brought him in for questioning 3 weeks later, though by then he had already resigned from Meridian Waves and left no forwarding address. The agent told me, carefully, that without him in custody, they couldn't fully close the case, only add his name to a growing list connected to the other disappearances, Holly's included, none of which have been resolved as of the day I'm telling you this. I still get the occasional cruise line advertisement in my inbox, algorithm-driven, completely unaware of what happened. I delete everyone without opening it. And some nights, when I can't sleep, I think about Holly laughing at that pool bar, telling me breakfast, tomorrow, don't be late, and I think about how easy it would have been for that message to have come from someone standing outside my own door instead of hers. A woman had come forward independently, a passenger from an entirely different Meridian Waves sailing the previous year, describing an almost identical pattern. A new friend met at a bar on board, a missed breakfast, an unscheduled muster drill. Except in her case, the friend had eventually turned up 2 days later, badly shaken, refusing to discuss what happened, and disembarking early at the next port without saying goodbye to anyone. That woman was willing to talk to investigators now, years later, because she said she'd finally worked up the nerve after seeing my public post asking if anyone else had noticed something off. What she described, once agents interviewed her formally, matched enough of Marcus's account and enough of the internal shift patterns pulled from the ship's own records that the case, according to the agent, had shifted in classification entirely, from a handful of unconnected disappearances to what she carefully called a pattern consistent with a targeted operation. I still write for the blog, though I've changed how I do it completely. Nothing posted until well after I've already left a location. Nothing tagging a hotel room or a cabin number, ever, no matter how much a sponsorship wants that specific detail included. It cost me 2 partnerships this year alone. I've decided I can live without both a lot more easily than I could live with finding out, the hard way, exactly how much a stranger with the right kind of access can build out of a single careless caption